Assalamu Alaikum, everyone. Jazakallah khair for being here for the second part of our series on Muslim Spain, or Al-Andalus. Inshallah, we will announce as we develop the schedule for January and February for other lectures. I think, inshallah, we're planning at least a 3, maybe more, 4 lecture series on British India. If any of you have any requests for a particular lecture that you would like to hear, please contact me or contact Tariq Rashid, and inshallah we can then go ahead and prepare for that. Obviously, there's a lot of different topics that we can cover, and I'll be more than happy to either cover it myself, or if it's something that's out of my depth, I can certainly go ahead and find a scholar who would be able to do that. But like I said, as far as in the winter, when there's nothing really else to do except stay indoors, which is what we've been doing with COVID anyway, inshallah, we'll go ahead and take a look at British India. There's some excellent books that I can also recommend. Some of you might be familiar with William Dalrymple, the British author, and his book, The Anarchy, which is his latest on the British East India Company. And if you read that, you'll go through the 5 stages of grief. You'll really be angry at what the British did with a theft of somewhere along the lines of $45 trillion from the Indian subcontinent. But it'll also show where India, and in particularly the Muslim world, fit into these broader colonial ambitions. For example, how did the British in India affect the Revolutionary War here in the United States? So inshallah, we'll go ahead and cover that. Well, when we left off last time, and I've been asked to go ahead and provide a bit of a summary because apparently there was some audio-video issue last week. Just to recap, we started talking about Al-Andalus and how it became part of the Muslim Empire in the early part of the 8th century. Really only 50 years after the beginning of the Umayyad period and after the end of the Khalifal period. We find that Islam had reached Europe, or Western Europe, by way of Tariq bin Ziyad crossing from North Africa into Spain, exploiting the divisions in the Visigoth kingdoms there, and then establishing really for the next almost 8 centuries some kind of Muslim foothold in Western Europe. We also talked about how at this time there was a movement east toward India in the same year. Muhammad bin Qasim reaches India. But a lot of the focus that we had last time was really looking at the ability for not only the spread of Islam in Spain, but also the kind of coexistence that the Muslim authority had when it came to other religions there. This was a place of unprecedented tolerance, and more than just tolerance, it was a place of acceptance and mutual respect, particularly among, of course, the 3 Abrahamic faiths, including Judaism and Christianity. The point to be made that here you had not only Jews and Christians living under Muslim rule, but you had Jews and Christians living within the establishment. As we talked about last time, Jews and Christians being part of the ruling class, having high positions within the administration, particularly in Cordoba. And then we also talked about the kind of intellectual output that was occurring in a place like Cordoba, one of the most advanced cities for its time in the world, certainly in Europe, with even paved lighting and gas lights, illumination, as well as paved streets within the city. But this idea about how Islam was now starting to influence intellectual thought was very, very important through people like Ibn Rushd and his influence on Maimonides, Musa bin Maimun, the great Jewish scholar, as well as Thomas Aquinas, the great Christian theologian and scholar. And as we talked about, that kind of slow seepage of Islamic influence into Western and European thought achieved two things. One is that it showed the impact that Islam was having on Western thought. And the second was the debt of gratitude that the West owes to the Islamic civilization for preserving a lot of what then becomes the foundation of Western thought, particularly when it came to ancient Greek, ancient Roman literature and knowledge. That was due to the fact that not only did Muslims preserve it and then move it forward, but also made it accessible. There was a real democratic sense of accessibility to the information. You didn't have to be a monk and you didn't have to be a Muslim to be able to access information from the several dozens of libraries that were in a place like Cordoba. And Cordoba was only one city in Spain in this capacity. You had Toledo, you had Seville, you had Granada. There was a wonderful synergy to be said about having all of this going on. But there were issues that were on the horizon. Clearly, especially the Christians didn't exactly feel that good about Spain being under Muslim rule. And at this time, we have to remember that the Crusades were starting to emerge as a reality in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. The fact that the Muslims were able to hold on to power for over 3 centuries by the end of the 11th century was pretty impressive. It showed that they were doing everything right. It showed that the other faiths and communities might have been jealous, but they certainly did enjoy the kind of life that was provided under Muslim rule. Perhaps the best thing that they appreciated was stability. I mean, here you have a society which was thriving, a society which was confident, a society which allowed for then inclusion on all levels. Obviously, there were certain barriers. I mean, only Muslims were going to be full citizens, but that did not mean that there was not an awful lot of access to everybody else. But slowly, Christians now started to mobilize to try to retake land which had been under Christian rule prior to the 8th century. And part of this has to do with the idea not so much of a hatred toward Muslims, but as a diversion from pre-existing issues that were facing Western Europe at the time. I think it's important to recognize that Western Europe was itself in a lot of turmoil with infighting. When we think about Western Europe at this time, we forget that it was in 1066 that a French a nobleman crossed the English Channel and challenged Harold at the Battle of Hastings, defeating him. Harold had an arrow shot through his eye. And then we have the start of the new British monarchy that goes all the way now until Queen Elizabeth II. So you see then there's this constant issue between France and Britain. This was being played out throughout Western Europe when it came to fighting for land and territory. And it's one of the reasons why the Pope finally decided that something needed to be done to create a diversion. This essentially was really what the Crusades were about. Instead of infighting amongst ourselves, as they would say, go ahead and find something else to do. It was also helped greatly by the fact that the Seljuk Turks defeated the Byzantines in Asia Minor in what's known as the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, which got then Western Europe worried that Eastern Christian Europe was not going to be in a position to go ahead and protect and serve as a buffer against Muslims. A little closer. Better? Okay. So it's important to understand that what starts to happen in Muslim Spain is not in isolation. it also shows the way that Western Europe saw the entire Muslim world, which was so dominant at this place. If you are that motivated, and if you realize that the Muslim world, because it is so vast at this point, is going to have difficulty holding on to power everywhere, and particularly at the very frontier of the empire. I mean, after all, in 1085, the center of the Muslim empire is Baghdad. And here we have the very outer limit of the Muslim empire. So the fact that then the ability to defend it, the ability to hold it, is going to be compromised to a certain degree. And Toledo is the first city to fall in 1085. This then creates an opportunity. One victory is enough to motivate the Christians to say, well, this can be done again. And we find, though, that it takes another 150 years before Cordoba itself falls, and then Seville falls 12 years after that. We need to, I think, as an ummah, be honest enough to recognize that the fall of Spain really begins with infighting. And there's a certain symmetry that's involved, that we were, alhamdulillah, lucky, and we were certainly skilled in taking advantage of infighting among the Visigoths in the Iberian Peninsula to get into Spain. There's a lesson to be learned about unity. There's a lesson to be learned about division when it comes to being able to survive and then even thrive. And it speaks volumes that by the middle of the 13th century, by the 1200s, Muslim Spain had gone from really almost the entire Iberian Peninsula to now just the area around Granada. And for those of you who have been to southern Spain, you know that this is a far smaller area than the rest of Spain. Spain is actually a very large country. Even if you were to take the high-speed train, going from, say, Barcelona, which isn't even all the way on the east, all the way to, say, Seville, will take several hours. Even a flight from, say, Madrid to Granada is at least about an hour and a half long. So just something to keep in mind when we get there. Well, how does Toledo then fall, or what is one of the contributing factors? It happens to be a Muslim dynasty based not in Spain, but based in Africa. And this is the Almoravids. So what you have here in a rather Spanish map is a dynasty which was based in North Africa, around Morocco particularly, but also spread south into what would be today Mali and Mauritania. And it was there for 100 years. I mean, I think it's important to realize that many of these dynasties, as part of the bigger Abbasid Empire at the time, had quite a bit of territory and had quite a bit of power under their belt. And we find that this decline and fall of the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, as we talked about last time, under the founding by Abdurrahman and moving forward, had to do with opportunism and had to do with ambition for more. And here you have the Almoravids, who are a Berber dynasty, so they are not Arab, they are from North Africa. They invade Spain. And their rationale for invading Spain was to consolidate these taifas, these smaller kingdoms that had occurred when the caliphate was starting to weaken and these smaller kingdoms started to fall. They could not be as strong as the whole, the sum of the parts. And what we find then is by 1085, they have become very successful in what they achieved. Now, their rationale for coming in is going to be that we wanted to stop the further erosion of Spain and for it to be conquered by the Christians. And I think that in fairness, that is something that the Almoravids did provide. They did prevent the fall completely of Al-Andalus. There was the Battle of Sagras, which in 1086 was very, very pivotal because it defeated the Christian kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. And keep those names in mind because we'll definitely keep coming back to them. They were successful in reconsolidating the kingdom and bringing some of these smaller principalities under one Muslim banner. Many of you are familiar with ancient Greece, and you know about cities like Athens, and you know about cities like Sparta. These were city-states. They weren't necessarily big empires to themselves. And in many ways, what we have to do is consider Spain to be at this time like that. You had these provinces, or you had these principalities, like Seville, like Almeria, like Granada, like Malaga, which is right on the coast. And at least now we have some kind of unity. And this is something that the Almoravids went ahead and brought together. But there's still a decline. And I think that sometimes what we forget when we're looking at history is what is the psychological impact on a people who are being under siege. The fact that they were attacked in the first place must have been quite a jolt. The fact that they started to lose territory was an even bigger trauma. And the fact that now you have the Almoravids coming in essentially like the cavalry and having to save you is a little bit of a psychological wounding, because you realize that you weren't able to go ahead and hold on to it yourself. Well, the Almoravids definitely were successful in stopping the flow of decline that could have happened. It is the next dynasty that comes in that becomes quite damaging and quite destructive. The Almoravids now have to deal with the Almohads, a dynasty which came in to, again, northern Africa, defeated the Almoravids there, and then placed their eyes on the prize of Europe. So when the Almoravids are defeated in Morocco, the Almohads say, let's keep going, let's cross into Spain. And by 1170, the Almohads now have taken control of Muslim Spain. But the problem with them is that their outlook was decidedly more puritanical, it was more conservative, and it was far less tolerant. Their tolerance, or their intolerance, shall we say, had several different targets. One target was non-Muslims, and the other target really was the Muslims who had now been in Spain for centuries, who had set the agenda of a kind of tolerance for other religions. And the reason that I bring this up is there's something to be said about Muslims who have lived in multicultural and multi-faith societies, and the way that they are able to coexist. They have a different way of dealing than those who come from societies that are more religiously homogeneous. It works well when Muslims are in the majority. It works well when they are in a position of authority. It becomes problematic, as we see, for example, in India, where the majority then is lost and the political authority is lost. But even despite that, there is still a hard wiring in those Muslims who have lived in these kinds of multi-ethnic, multi-religious, religious societies, multicultural societies as well, on dealing with difference. I think South Africa probably is a bit of an example of that as well. And for the Almohads, one of their big issues was their inability to understand multiculturalism and pluralism. They saw it as a deficit, they saw it as a liability, they saw it as a weakness, and arguably they saw it as the very reason why Muslim Spain became vulnerable to attack. That's a very tenuous argument. Because after all, the people who attacked Muslim Spain were not those who were living inside Muslim Spain. This was not an insurrection from Christians and Jews from the inside. And it's interesting because when you think about the Crusades as well, Christians who were already living in Palestine and Syria were not the ones who took up arms against the Muslims. In fact, the Western Crusaders, when they came to Jerusalem, they were not very happy with the Christians there. They saw them as being sellouts. They saw them as being untrustworthy because of the fact that they saw the Muslims with mutual respect. The restrictions that the Almohads then start to implement on non-Muslims becomes suffocating. And those who could leave, in fact, did. But the main reason why you see Jews and Christians leaving Muslim rule at this time in Spain was because of the instability that the Almohads brought. There was a certain unpredictability by which they were operating. They were clearly not familiar with the cultural dynamics of Spain. These were Berbers from Morocco. They had a particular perspective that was not very well attuned to or aligned with what was the cultural vibe, if you will, of Spain. It's interesting, though, that when it came to Jews in Spain, they may have left or fled Spain, but they didn't leave or flee Muslim land. In fact, the Jews left, and many of them went to North Africa in places that weren't necessarily under Almohad rule. But they also made it as far as Egypt, and some, of course, made it even into Syria and elsewhere. But a lot of them still stayed in Spain, and part of that was the reason is that they had lives there that went back several generations, and they found ways to accommodate. But we mentioned Maimonides last time, Musa bin Maimun. This is how he ends up in Egypt and becomes the personal physician of none other than Salahuddin, the great Ayyubid leader, who then in 1187 was able to successfully take Jerusalem back from the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin. Okay. Now, the Almohads were finally defeated by a combined Christian force from Portugal, from the kingdoms of Castile, the kingdom of Aragon, at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. The Christians, of course, saw this as prophetic because of the fact that the year was 1212. There's nothing particularly religious about the year 1212 other than it's 1212. If you're a numerologist, I'm sure there must be something there. But it's kind of an ironic situation that in order to remove the intolerance of Muslims, it required Christian conquest in order to do that. This then becomes Spain in the 13th century. At one time, almost that entire area would have been red under Muslim rule. And now we find that it has shrunk to just this southern province of Granada. Lost then are the cities of Seville. Lost is the city of Cordoba. Lost is the city of Toledo. All now have been absorbed by Castile. Castile and Aragon are the two major kingdoms by this time. There were several others which then were conquered by Castile and Aragon. So who's been to the Alhambra? One, Conrad's been two, yeah, three, see some nodding, four, okay. Well, I kind of figured I'd hope that he, no, the first time I went solo. So I just happened to be in Europe, but I had to go scout it for everyone else. You've never been? I mean, I know, I get that South Africa's pretty, but okay. Do yourself a favor and go to Granada. Inshallah, I think one of the things that we should really do is consider field trips, especially for our young people, because this is heritage that is still well preserved. I think that they would benefit greatly from going to these places, seeing it in person, and also seeing the footprint that Islam has left in places. It's something that will send you through all the various emotions, pride, sadness, lament, hope, maybe some anger in there as well. But I think ultimately it's important to have that exercise going through. But these are the Sierra Nevada mountains behind it, and this is the Alhambra Palace. That building right in the front or in the middle is actually not part of the original Alhambra. That is the palace of Charles V. It is kind of a victory palace after the Christians conquered Granada. But here are some of the images of this last outpost of Muslim rule in Spain. My recommendation, if you're not going on a field trip with me, is if you go to Granada, do two things. One, book your ticket to the Alhambra in advance. Don't get there and expect to be able to walk in. Even the time, first of all, it's timed entry. And the queue for just people who hold their tickets can be hundreds of people long. And if there's any tickets or cancellations, then the other line gets to move, which usually is a half a mile long on a summer morning. So yeah, get your tickets online in advance. The other thing that I would strongly recommend is get the full ticket. Get it for the palace and get it for the gardens, the Generalife. If you have allergies, take medicine. It's worth it. The gardens are stunning. And one of the things that you'll recognize that the Muslims were doing in Spain was literally trying to recreate images of Jannah on earth. And one place that they do that is at the Alhambra, with all the green, all the water. And it's remarkable how water is used in Granada and at the Alhambra. There's a walk that you can take from the Alhambra all the way down to the city. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend walking up unless you want the exercise, but walking down is very nice. It's a very smooth and light slope down. But you'll see water in the wall going down through like a very nicely made niche that's next to you. And it's a way to drain the water from the top to go down without it creating a flood at the bottom. But just hearing the sound of water from the fountains is something that provides sukoon. It provides a real sense of tranquility and serenity, especially when there's no other sound there. But as you're driving, or if you're taking a coach around this part of Spain, especially if you take the bus from Granada up to Cordoba, you'll see in the landscape two things. You will see olive groves everywhere. Olive oil there is big, as are olives. And the other thing you'll see is, Kamran, what else did you see there? You saw that. Yeah. What else did you see as far as, what's that? Oranges are big, especially in Valencia. You see fig trees. And you realize, of course, what they were trying to do. They were inspired by Watini wa Zaytun. Yeah. It's fascinating to see that as you're driving around. And I mean, it's one of those things that, I mean, alhamdulillah, as a Muslim, you can, of course, appreciate it. But I've been to Granada with non-Muslims, and it's always interesting when you explain this to them, that the idea of inspiration is here you have a bunch of people who remember when the Muslims got to Spain, they were in a climate and in an ecosystem that was not the same that they knew from the Middle East. And to be in that area and to have that internal inspiration and to be able to then say, here's an opportunity where we can make that happen is really fascinating to see. Here again are the gardens of the palace with the water fountains everywhere. This poor unfortunate person is Muhammad the 11th. He has the distinction of being the last Muslim ruler in Spain. His name was Abu Abdullah, Muhammad Abu Abdullah the 11th. And so the Spaniards couldn't say Abu Abdullah for whatever reason, so they said Boabdil. That's a corruption of his name. So if you ever come across his name in any history book as Boabdil, this is who he was. And he was king for 10 years, the last 10 years of Muslim rule. And on January the 2nd of 1492, the combined forces of Castile and Aragon finally were able to defeat the Nasrid dynasty, which was Muhammad XI's dynasty, and they accepted his surrender. And there's a phrase that's very popular that you might have heard. In fact, it was even the title of a book by none other than Salman Rushdie, called The Moor's Last Sigh. By the way, the book was actually pretty good. Just saying. Here are Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, you've heard of Ferdinand and Isabella, obviously, because of Christopher Columbus, but I'm not sure if you knew what they look like. Well, now you know, and yeah, it's unfortunately not very flattering. But you see here that it was a marriage of bringing the two kingdoms together, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile and Leon. And as a result, with their combined armies, their combined wealth, they then are able to march on. And here we find on January the 2nd, as Granada falls, we have Abu Abdullah or Boabdil himself handing over symbolically the keys to Granada to Ferdinand and Isabella. They then give him and his family safe passage out of Granada. And so he then gets on his, or stays on his horse, and he then continues up into the mountains, the Sierra Nevadas. And there's a legend that he then, as he gets to that high point, turns around and he sees Granada beneath him. And by the way, the view of Granada from the top of the Alhambra is stunning. And this view, by the way, of the Alhambra is actually from across a valley, also on a hill, from the masjid in Granada, which was built in the early 2000s thanks to Saudi money. And it was the first masjid to be built in Spain in 500 years. So quite amazing. And people, Muslims and non-Muslims, go up there for the view because it is really the best view of the Alhambra. Did he take you there? Okay, just checking. Yeah, there's some controversy about that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's amazing how people just can't even agree about who paid for it, right? Yeah. So when Boabdil gets up to the mountains with his family, he turns around on his horse and he looks down and he exhales and he sighs. And so the Moor's last sigh is actually referring to Boabdil. And then it's said that he started to cry, weeping inconsolably. And his mother turned to him and said, supposedly, "Why do you weep now as a woman for what you could not hold on to as a man?" Yeah. What's that? Yeah, if any of you have ever been sort of put down by a parent, I don't think it comes close to that. Yeah. I remember when I heard that, I was like, all right, I got off easy when I was a kid, right, Mom? So, well, Ferdinand and Isabella, we talked about Christopher Columbus. The voyage to the Americas was absolutely a consequence of the fall of Muslim Spain. It is highly unlikely that it would have happened. Well, first of all, it wouldn't have happened when it did, but who knows if it would have happened in the way that it did. By the way, there was reporting just this week that the Vikings made it to the Americas at least 500 years before Columbus. So his stock seems to be falling even farther. He was from Genoa. Columbus himself was not Spanish. He was actually Italian. I think outside of Genoa, Italy, there's no place in Italy that really cares that he's Italian, except maybe people in New York. He's really embraced by Spain. there's a quite a prominent statue of him at the shoreline in Barcelona, if you've been there. And he's able to persuade Ferdinand and Isabella to then underwrite his voyages to find new routes to Asia. Why? Because by this time, the Ottoman Empire controlled the Eastern Mediterranean and the overland routes to Spain, or sorry, to Asia. So this was a way to circumvent that. Who paid for it? We did. The voyage was financed by confiscated property of Jews and Muslims. Many Muslims and Jews fled Granada because of fear of persecution. Those that did were correct. They needed to be fearful because the forces of the church came in, particularly with the Spanish Inquisition. So some of the most popular figures in Spanish history and in lore have connections to the Muslim era. And one of them is Al-Cid. He was actually known as Al-Siddi, and from that you come with El-Cid. Well, he was a Christian, but he was also a gun for hire, or a sword for hire. He wasn't fully the champion to the Christians that they tout him to be. Yes, he did fight against Muslims, but he also fought with and for Muslims, which shows again the kind of ambiguity that you find when it comes to faith lines and divisions in Spain. But here is the Spanish Inquisition. It was established by Ferdinand and Isabella. It lasted for 300 and nearly 360 years. That is long by any measure. And initially it started off to identify heretics, who were people who were violating Christian ideas. And of course, top of the list were Jews and Muslims. There was an effort to try to then convert Muslims and Jews. And in doing so, there were tests. There were loyalty tests. And some of these loyalty tests may seem to be rather primitive. They would make you recite the Bible. They would also monitor if you went to church. And there were a lot of Muslims and Jews who, because of the pressure, they did at least appear to be Christians in public. But for Muslims in particular, there were other tests that were done. And they did this with Jews, forcing them to eat pork or wine in public. But the way that they suspected that maybe Muslims might not be true conversos, meaning converts, does anyone know how they were able to check? What was the incriminating thing? Kamran, you're nodding your head. How were they able to find out that Muslims hadn't really converted? Yes. So it was actually water usage. If in a Muslim home, the usage of water did not drop after converting to Christianity, they suspected that they were still Muslim. Why? Because they were doing wudu and they were doing ghusl. Because at this time, to really show your loyalty to Christianity, the dirtier you were, the more pious you were. In fact, monks used to wear the same outfit for 1 year until it literally rotted on their bodies. It must have smelled awful, but that's how it was. Interrogations, torture, trial by ordeal. By the end of it, it went from convert or leave to convert or die. There's a book that I have at the end, a recommendation by Andrew Carr, which talks about that 150-year period afterwards. It was the Ottoman Empire that knew something was going on and came to the rescue of not only Muslims, but also Jews. And it was Sultan Bayezid II, who was the father of Salim the Grim and the son of Mehmet II. who conquered Istanbul. He sent ships to Spain and was able to rescue 150,000 Muslims and Jews. The Jews of Spain then settled in places like Sarajevo, in Salonika, in Izmir, and in Istanbul. They didn't settle in Palestine because Palestine was actually not a very exciting place. And the Jews of Spain still live in Istanbul, and they still live in Salonika and in Izmir, or their descendants. The Spaniards love to commemorate their victory over the Muslims, and you'll see these festivals occurring everywhere. The Moros y Cristianos festival in places like Valencia. I mean, this is like in America in the summer when we have state fairs. This is how they commemorate it. The feast day of St. George, coinciding with the feast day of St. James, parades, fireworks, medieval music, a battle around a castle that's entitled Convert or Die. They also, in Spanish culture, make it a point to emphasize the eating of pork. It is everywhere. Pork or like ham slices on melon. It's just infused in everything. And they eat it almost as a matter of defiance, to say, this is what we can do because we won. Okay. The very first modern novel was written by Miguel de Cervantes, and it's called Don Quixote. If you've ever taken a course in Spanish, you've had to read some of it. It's actually an amazing book. And here you see Don Quixote with his sidekick Sancho Panza. And what's amazing about this book is if you read it, you have Don Quixote, who's this sort of old throwback figure to a bygone era. And he wishes things could be like that again. And he goes around, he's a little bit kind of kooky. But there's a scene early in the book where he goes into a town with his sidekick, and he comes across a town that's like a ghost town. And you realize when you read the book and you're a Muslim that this town was probably a Muslim town that was either abandoned or the Muslims had to leave. So when you look at this very influential book, you see then hints and shades of Islam and Muslim society and the way that they interacted. Inshallah, I think, is it time for Isha? Well, please come back and we will finish up and deal with the questions as well. Jazakallah khair. Okay, Assalamu Alaikum everyone. Why don't we take our seats for those of you who are interested, and we'll get started and continue, inshallah. So usually this is the question answer period. But I thought what I would do is, perhaps, if you'll allow me, is take a little bit of lecturer's privilege by asking the first questions myself. One of the central features of Muslim Spain, especially for Muslims, is its example as is that it's whether it was a place of tolerance. After 9/11 particularly, Muslim Spain was invoked by not only Muslims, but also fair-minded non-Muslims, Jews and Christians, to say yes, to answer the question that can Muslims get along with non-Muslims. Here was an example that not only could they get along, but they could get along when they were actually in power. And this became a very common thread by which people were then discussing the issue of Muslims after 9/11. And there was an avalanche of documentation. In fact, a dear friend of mine who's been here at the IAGD, a man by the name of Jacob Bender, some of you might remember him, came several years ago. He is now, by the way, the executive director of CARE Philadelphia. He is by his own admission, a very left-leaning Jewish American. And he made a documentary shortly after 9/11 called The Three Wise, out of Cordoba. It was supposed to be called The Three Wise Men of Cordoba. And it was based around Maimonides, Ibn Rushd, and also Aquinas. But within that, he interweaves the idea of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish interaction, particularly Muslim and Jewish interaction. And so really that empathy that he has is one that is forged from Muslim Spain and his tremendous knowledge about that. But like with everything else, there has to be a certain broad assessment. One cannot really answer the question yes or no. When inquiring about whether Muslim Spain was really as tolerant as many say it was, the answer is yes and no. And I say this as a way to then provide instruction that when you are confronted with the question, you're not then placed in a gotcha moment. Because invariably what happens is you're going to reach two kinds of people. One who actually come to you with genuine curiosity and an authentic quest for knowledge and wanting to know what was the situation. And you can tell them that, yes, it was tolerant. But then there are people who will come to you and will usually be equipped with a few facts and trivia points and talking points by which they'll say, well, no, what about this? And what about this? And invariably they'll say, oh, well, if it was so tolerant, then what about the Almohads? And why did Maimonides have to leave? And then you're kind of stuck like deer caught in the headlights of then saying, well, actually. And so it's always important then to leave yourself the kind of space by knowing not only all the history, but being honest and saying, look, it was good. And yet at the same time, we need to go ahead and talk about those areas that are problematic. And invariably what you'll find is that the problematic areas were not just targeting non-Muslims. As we talked about before, the Muslims in Spain were in as much of a firing line by the Almohads as were the others. But we like to talk about things in relative terms. Jews and Christians were treated better in Muslim Spain than they were anywhere else in Europe, especially if you were somebody who was a Christian not from the higher socioeconomic levels. There was a tremendously egalitarian system within Muslim Spain. So if you were not the lord of some manor or some feudal bigwig, you still had the opportunity to have dignity, to earn a living, and not have to live in squalor in Spain. And Jews by far were better treated and in fact preferred to live in Muslim lands for two reasons. One, that they did not carry with them the burden and the stigma of being blamed for the death of Isa alayhi salam, which was of course rampant throughout Europe. When the Crusades, as we talked about last time, began, Jews were oftentimes used as target practice by the Crusaders as they went eastward, just so that they could get them into a frenzy on how to kill people who were regarded as the infidel. But there was also the other issue that was undeniable. The kind of religious ethos that Jews and Muslims have, in many ways, Islam was version 2.0 of Judaism, in the sense of hygiene, in the sense of dietary regulations, in the sense of even the theologically strict monotheism that Jews and Muslims had. As a result of it, and also the fact that there was no issue of persecution, the fact that Jews understood their demographic reality of numbers, and that the Muslims did not take advantage of that by exploiting them or by inferiorizing them in Spain, it proved to be a healthy relationship. And you will see this reflected in the cross-pollination of culture, the music of Al-Andalus, the art of Al-Andalus, the architecture of Al-Andalus, and the cuisine of Al-Andalus. When we think about Jewish cuisine, today, we think largely of bagels and smoked salmon and various things that you might find in an episode of Seinfeld or at your local delicatessen. That is actually, of course, it comes from Jewish culture, but it is almost entirely European or Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine. If you were to take a look at Sephardic, which is the Jews of Spain and Portugal, their cuisine, or the cuisine of Jews from North Africa, it's going to be very similar to that of the Muslims of these regions. The tagine, which of course is emblematic of Moroccan food. You'll find similarly when it comes to the Jews of the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, the Mizrahi Jews, you will find that their cuisine bears resemblance more to Arab food than it will to the Ashkenazi food. There was no smoked salmon in the diet of the Jews of Spain. There was no bagels in the diet of the Jews of Spain. They ate what was available, and they availed themselves of the spices and sharing recipes as well. So again, a very important thing to recognize. Now, the other thing, of course, that is levied against the Muslims is that they did not treat the Jews and the Christians as full citizens. They treated them as dhimmi. Absolutely right. But here's what needs to be qualified about that. The issue of dhimmitude was two things. One, it was a contract. Muslims were bound to provide protection for non-Muslims living under their authority, provided that they were then paid the jizya. The jizya exempted them from military service, and it also put them into a binding contract for protection. That was a system that did not exist in Christian Europe. There was no obligation beyond a quote-unquote moral obligation to protect any subject under that authority. The other issue, of course, that is important to remember is that at this time, political authority was a function of whether you were a member of the religion of the state. If you were a Christian, then you were considered a full citizen. You had to not just be a Christian, you had to be the denomination of the state. So if you were a Catholic, if it was a Catholic area, you needed to be a Catholic. If you happened to be a Protestant or something else, it didn't make you a full citizen of the realm. So the idea then that people's citizenship status, if you want to call it that, under Muslim rule was somehow or the other an aberration. It was not. It was in keeping. And the way that these things were determined is, again, your citizenship was similar to those people who might be a green card holder. There are many people in the United States who prefer to maintain their green card, their lawful permanent residence, because they may have some interests elsewhere or some priorities. And then they also make a determination, well, what will I gain if I become a US citizen? The right to vote and the right to certain state benefits. Before 1996, you would be able to get federal benefits even if you were a green card holder. So it's all really a matter of what people then see is whether it's worth their while. If you wanted the full package, all you had to do was convert to Islam. And a lot of people did do that because, especially from the other faiths at the time, there really weren't those kinds of distinctions. And it probably was worth their while economically and socially and politically to do so. But the one indisputable fact was that you did not have to be a Muslim to gain access to the political, the economic, and the educational opportunities in Spain. They were open to anybody and everybody, irrespective of your class, your religion, your race, your ethnicity, etc. So I leave it up to you then to decide where and how tolerant that really is. Then there's another question I think that's important. Muslims still consider Spain to have been an Arab outpost. And when you listen to some of the arguments and the debates today about Spain by European Christians. They look at Islam in general and Muslims in Spain as being invaders. They look at them as being inauthentic. They look at them as being un-European. And for those of you who, of course, are tracking what's going on in India, it bears an eerie parallel to the language that Islam came by force. It is not an original language of India. And I was looking at something today on Facebook where they were talking about a poster for Diwali, and it was Jashan-e, God, I can't remember exactly what the phrase was being used, but the person who was quite clearly a supporter of the BJP and Hindutva objected to this because it was using Urdu as the language, and a phrase that was not part of the what Bharat was and what was Hindu. Of course, the irony of this was that he was complaining about a language that actually is authentically an Indian language, Urdu. But he was making the complaint in a language which is clearly not from India. He was making the criticism in English. So it shows you then the opportunism and the hypocrisy by which these are going on. So the question then is, who were the Moors? And again, the word Moor, it means that they came from Morocco. In Spanish, they're known as the Moriscos. The Jews of Spain were known as the Marranos. Were they Arab? Were they Berber? Were they North African? Were they Asian? Were they European? Who were the Moors? Okay. And again, it has this rather annoying relevance still when Muslims in Europe are challenged every day for being inauthentic and non-indigenous. And I suppose perhaps the better question is, when were they not European? I mean, from the year 711, Muslims have been in Spain. And think about it from the standpoint of us in the United States. There is going to come a time, I hope, that maybe not in your generation, or your children's generation, but somewhere down the line, they are not going to self-identify with their ethnic native origin identity. They're going to say, I'm an American. They're not going to hyphenate. They're not going to put qualifications, especially if it is a country that they have not visited. I mean, like I said, think 6, 7 generations down the line here. Even if you don't want to something more close in proximity. This is a hugely important question. And I would argue that here you have a people who were in Spain for 8 centuries. I think by 1492, it's safe to say that the Moors of Spain were definitely European. And Islam was definitely a European religion, because of course Islam came to Europe as Christianity came to Europe, as Judaism came to Europe. None of these religions were indigenous to Europe. You want to talk about the Druids? Okay, that would be perhaps an indigenous religion to Europe. But just as we find European origin Americans telling Muslims and others to go home because they claim as though they just grew out of the ground here. I think you see these parallels when it comes to Europe as well. Just to show you then, in the year 1500, Spain at this point, of course, is not under Muslim rule, but look at all of the areas that were under Muslim rule. And that purple line that's going indicates the entire Muslim world at this time. And here are some of the major empires. So one of the things that happened is that even though the fall of Spain, or Muslim Spain, occurred, and it was traumatic and it is still felt, it was not the complete implosion of Muslim power. Here's a short bibliography if anybody wants to take a look at books, and I'll go through each one of them. The Ornament of the World is written by Maria Rosa Manocal, who is the chair of Iberian languages, meaning Spanish and Portuguese, at Yale University. And this book came out at just the right time, right after 9/11. And it was highly influential in setting the record straight about Muslims in Spain. The next book is called Blood and Faith, The Purging of Muslim Spain. And this is the book that I referred to regarding the Spanish Inquisition. It's an excellent, excellent book on that topic. Some of the classic books on Spain during the Muslim era were written by Richard Fletcher, Stanley Lane Poole, and Hugh Kennedy. But then this other book that I found that came out more recently, Kingdoms of Faith, A New History of Islamic Spain by Brian Catlos, is also very, very good. So these are safe books. These are books that you can recommend to anybody if they want to learn. And I always recommend books to non-Muslim audiences that are written by non-Muslims, because that way there's not the presumption that the text is loaded or biased. And quite honestly, and it's not much of a surprise, sometimes, quite frankly, books that are written by not just Muslims on Muslim subjects, but anything on a particular subject is going to carry some bias. So these are readily available. They're not just going to be found at Halal Co. or something. They can be found on Amazon or other sites. So they're accessible to people as well.